The protagonist was standing in front of the young guy when he suggested they break up, and then she excitedly asked him what he meant. And as a result, in the twilight of Friday, these were the words she heard at the party on the occasion of the return of the second son of the Count of Clermont, after which the man calmly said that he had already said everything he wanted to say, and he no longer wants to be her fiancé. Hearing this, madly shocked protagonist literally did not understand what happened to Francois Joseph about after all. They were engaged. But he coldly looked at her and told her that he simply did not love her anymore. At that moment, he was approached by a girl who asked Francois Joseph why he did not tell the truth to his former fiancée that they loved each other. It was Adelaide Grand. Louise de Blois looked at them in shock and literally did not understand what they were talking about. But the girl smiled smugly and apologized to the protagonist for what had happened, and said that she and Francois Joseph really loved each other. Then Adelaide Grand smiled wickedly and wondered if Louise de Blois was not happy for them. And she only wondered fiercely whether this girl really wished to hear words of joy from her, and she did not understand how these people could be so shameless. And then approaching with all her anger struck Francois Joseph so hard that he burst into tears. And at this moment, Louise de Blois thought only that she was not yet so mad as to be glad for them. The next moment, Adelaide Grand ran excitedly up to Francois Joseph, and looking at Louise, inquired what she was doing. But the girl only looked at the two with contempt, and said that now that she knew of their affair, she was breaking off their engagement. Then informed Francois Joseph that they were separated, and looking at his crazily pathetic and awkward face, informed him that he should have told the Marquis the news himself, and reminded him not to forget to mention the reason for breaking their engagement. Adelaide, only looking in the wake of the departing girl, shouted for Louise de Blois to stop, for such behavior would be so easily forgiven her, but the girl wasn't even going to do that. And in the end, soon returned to her friends, who excitedly looked around her wondering why she had returned alone, and where was Mr. Francois Joseph, for they had gone together to the garden. But she smiled and told the girls that she had just broken off their engagement. And then they excitedly asked if the main character was okay, because she was probably feeling absolutely shattered right now. But in the end, they realized that there was no point in being sad, and they should support the girl. One of them said that she had once experienced similar moments in her life, and she knew that in such situations, alcohol was the best companion. And the other girl happily said that they had to get drunk in order to flood the emptiness in her heart. After which the striking tinkling sides made a toast and drank to the release of Elisa from her unnecessary bonds of marriage. But the next moment, one of the girls, looking around the crowd excitedly, said that today it was not so easy to approach Mr. Theodore Clermont, and she did not understand why this fellow appeared here. After all, he had not appeared at such receptions for a long time. After that, the friend of the main character remembered an interesting fact that Louise de Blois, together with Theodore Clermont, studied at the same military academy. So the girl asked what memories were Louise about the young man in those days, because according to rumors in his youth, Theodore Clermont was like a wild dog. But in the next moment, all excitedly became silent when they saw Adelaide Grand enter with Francois Joseph. And then the friends of the protagonist, displeased, looked around them, not understanding how they dared to come here in such a way. And it seems that the rumors turned out to be true, and they should be very ashamed. After which the girls said that they had not even expected that Mr. Francois Joseph would turn out to be such a terrible man. But Louise de Blois only thought sadly that she had actually suspected it, because every time Louise de Blois saw Francois Joseph with Adelaide, he could not take his eyes off her, and she was insanely beautiful in a silk dress with bright bows and ruffles. Then she reflected that perhaps because she considered Francois Joseph her fiancé, as well as her best friend, she was desperately trying to turn a blind eye to everything that was going on, and the girl really thought herself a complete idiot for not noticing it sooner, and could not prevent such a disgrace, for she clung to the young man like an idiot all this time, unable to let him go, whereupon Louise de Blois remembered me at their first meeting, and then Francois Joseph approached her, bowed and greeted the girl, and congratulated her on her safe return, and then reached out to her to take her hand in his and kiss it. But the agitated protagonist only reported that her hands were all in the dust, but he calmly reported that the girl had nothing to worry about. Then with a smile, he said that it was a great pleasure for him to meet such an amazing person. Remembering this moment, Louise de Blois admitted to herself that because of such a bright smile that Francois Joseph had bestowed on her, her girlfriend felt somehow special. But the next moment, unable to stand their company, the protagonist excitedly ran out into the street, and her frightened friends, seeing such behavior, did not know how to react. Being outside the estate girl thought that if she knew that it would end up like this, she would never have agreed to marry Francois Joseph. For even though she knew that the young man's heart might have changed, she still could not believe that he could have done such a terrible thing. Then tears began to roll down her cheeks one after another, and the girl thought that if time could be turned back, she would like to go back to the day when she had fallen in love with the words and smile of Francois Joseph. Then, as Louise de Blois fell exhaustedly to the ground and still sobbing, she thought that if she had had a chance to make things right, she would never have fallen in love with this young man. She'd asked that God would show her mercy and bring her back that day, and if God was even a little sorry for the girl, he could do it. After which she lost consciousness, and her last thoughts were pleading for God to bring her back. Eventually, she found herself in a room and completely chained, and then addressing her by his full name, the speaker informed the girl that because of her sin, she would be executed. But she was agitated and didn't understand what he was talking about and what she had done wrong. And at the last moment, she screamed that she didn't want to die. But in real life, she screamed too. But someone's crazy concerned voice kept calming her down and told her that she really shouldn't have been afraid because she was safe now. But excited Louise de Blois only thought that she was glad that it all turned out to be just a dream. And then the excited voice asked whether the girl had a dream, and then calmed her down and said that now everything was fine because he was near. At this moment, slowly opening her eyes after a dream, the main character thought that this voice was familiar to her, then jumped up excitedly from her seat when she saw the man in front of her, and wondered why she was here with him, in a room she was seeing for the first time. After which she carefully looked at Mr. Theodore Clermont in front of her and began to think in a panic that she had just had a nightmare. But she had absolutely no idea how she had ended up in the same room with that wild dog Theodore Clermont. Then, looking at his smiling and seemingly pleased face with excitement, the girl wondered how it was that she had ended up here. Then she began to remember that she had recently broken off her engagement to Francois Joseph. Then she had gotten drunk, and the next morning she found herself in the same room with this man. After which memories crept into her head that Theodore Clermont was the second son of the illustrious Knight Earl of Clermont, and the Emperor's younger sister Claire, the Countess Amelia. Also, she and this young man had attended the same military academy, and Theodore Clermont had been the centerpiece of the celebration at which she had broken off her engagement. And though yesterday she had been madly shattered by the news, but now looking about her, she was madly glad that her clothes were still on. Then she asked Mr. Theodore Clermont what had happened, but he only smilingly inquired did the girl have absolutely no memory, and explained that he had brought her here after finding her drunk and unconscious in the garden. And the protagonist only awkwardly wondered if he really saved her. Then in shock, remembering all that happened yesterday, thought about how huge was her shame for such behavior, because she clearly should not have so much to drink yesterday. I mean, if anyone else saw it, there would have been some insanely awful rumors. But afterwards, she wondered whether nobody but Mr. Theodore Clermont had even tried to help her. After which she remembered at once that they had indeed spent a great deal of time together at the military academy, but the girl was sure that they had never been intimate. And this guy had completely lost his mind during the knighting ceremony, and he was called the Wild Dog, and everyone knew him. So after looking him over carefully, she wondered what the reason for her rescue was. But the guy only smiled and inquired about what Louise de Blois thought so much, but dissatisfied with the protagonist, stated that it was much more important to understand why this young man suddenly began to call her mistress. She wondered if something had happened between them that she didn't remember. But then he looked at her with a sudden scrutiny and said that she should be more careful in the future, because if she wasn't, it would be a disgrace. Then he moved closer and pressed the girl into the wall and informed her that even if nothing had happened between them the night before, he had held back so long that even one night wouldn't change anything. After which, with a smile, Theodore Clermont said that Louise de Blois could anticipate that they had failed last night and everything was fine. And the excited protagonist only wondered why suddenly Theodore Clermont began to behave in such a way. After all, he had only saved her. The next moment, the man came closer and whispered in her ear that he wanted to do something indecent with his mistress. But at that moment, she reacted quickly and pushed him and ran away. Although she was insanely displeased and didn't understand the man's behavior, she thought about the fact that she had seen enough of all sorts of idiots in her life. The guy reacted to such a reaction with a smile and wondered if the protagonist was going to leave so early and warned that they would definitely meet again soon. As a result, the girl literally, with the speed of light, flew to the family home, and the excited maid looking at her, asked where the mistress was past the night, after which she smelled the smell of alcohol from her. But at that moment, after looking her over carefully, her nanny asked what Louise had with her face and why she looked so agitated. And at that moment, the protagonist realized that she should definitely hide the fact that she had spent the night in the same room with Theodore, especially considering that it was right after her engagement broke up. So Louise de Blois smiled awkwardly to hide her embarrassment and excitement, and informed her that nothing serious had really happened, and suggested the woman get ready for work as soon as possible. Eventually, the excited woman agreed and helped the girl bring her hair in order. Then, with a smile looking her over, reported that the protagonist did look insanely majestic today, and in the entire empire there would be no knight better than her in conquests. Then, looking at herself in the mirror, the girl stated that she was a knight of the empire and deputy commander of the knights, and she was also the heiress of a respected family that had always protected the royal family. Then the girl thought about what had happened and told her nurse that she could not grieve forever, and thought that it would take her some time to understand what happened at dawn. But it did not matter now. So she was sure, looking before her, to think that her engagement had been broken off quite recently. And so, because of the shock, she had thought all sorts of foolish things concerning Theodore Clermont. Eventually, some more time passed, and the girl was already practicing on the training field and diligently practicing all her techniques. And seeing her, a young man named Maurice de Rie came up to her and handed the girl a towel. He said that her sword, as always, was insanely sharp, and wished her good morning. Seeing him, the protagonist immediately remembered that this guy was the son of her mother's closest aide, and they grew up together like brother and sister. In the end, Maurice de Rie, smiling at the protagonist, said that he literally sees her as a countess in her best years, but she calmly thanked him for the towels and told the guy that it was too much to compare her to her mother. But the next moment, an excited girl ran up to the young people and said hello to Maurice and the main character, and informed them that they had all gotten up insanely early today. But after the excited girl noticed that Louise de Blois looked much better today than she expected, although of course she had heard how the girl had gotten drunk at the party last night and was ready to tear the whole place apart. But after winking at the protagonist, she said that as she thought their nights were the best, even in drinking alcohol. It was Liver de Lucy, and looking at her, the protagonist immediately thought that although this girl was from the common people, but among the knights, she was widely known for her unrivaled ability to gather information. But unfortunately, she has been unable to get a promotion for several years because of her recklessness. Whereupon she sadly remarked that the news of the breaking of her engagement had reached even Lady Lavard de Lucy, who was not even at the party. But after pulling her out of her musings, the girl calmly said that she thought Eloise was in for some hard times, because no matter how much the commander favored her, it was all too much. But at that moment, Maurice stepped on her foot to silence her at last. And this did not go unnoticed by the protagonist, who looked at the young man unhappily and asked him what he was trying so desperately to hide. But he waved his hands excitedly and said that he really didn't know anything. But the protagonist was literally furious at such a wanton lie, and so drew her sword, which gleamed wickedly in the sun, and informed her that Mr. Maurice de Rie should have thought about his behavior as soon as possible, and told her all that he was holding back. And then the mad young man grudgingly reported that Lady Lavard de Lucy's long tongue had always been a source of trouble, and reported that the first thing they should have done was to go to the study. Then looked carefully at the protagonist, informed that even if her main task is to participate in the showdown on the battlefield, she can't ignore paperwork all the time. Then excitedly turning away, the guy said that they had to go back to work, and Lady Lavard de Lucy ran after him. The protagonist that watched all this excitedly did not understand what was happening in the office at this time, since everyone is so excited. But when she entered her office, she found that it was quiet enough. But then excited thoughts immediately popped into her head that her office, which should be cluttered with a lot of paperwork, now looked perfectly clean. So she excitedly went inside to look inside. But at that moment, she was approached by a young man by name, which frightened her very much. And when Louise de Blois turned around, she asked who he was. But the man only said that as he had previously reported that they were indeed about to meet. After which Theodore Clermont sat down on one knee and kissed her palm, and said that last Friday he had been appointed assistant to the deputy commander of the knights, and his name was Theodore Clermont. After which he said with an insanely satisfied smile that it would be a great honor for him to work together with the mistress. And they're literally shocked, looking at him, literally could not find any adequate words to comment on the situation. Finally, she immediately left the office, and the girl burst into the commander's office and excitedly asked what the hell had happened to her new assistant. But he, relaxedly wiping a bottle of expensive alcohol, said that now she was deputy commander and she could not be left without an assistant. But the girl, running to the table and putting her hands on it, shouted excitedly that the commander had appointed Theodore without even consulting her, and that she should have had the right of choice and had never chosen so wild a young man to be her assistant. And the man, absolutely not distracted from his monotonous work and scrutinizing the alcohol, said that I understand perfectly well the feeling of Eloise, and this appointment meant only that they all believed in the main character insanely strongly. And she looked at the commander in shock and wondered what he meant. But looking at her madly surprised face, the commander said that whatever Mr. Theodore Clermont's past was, he was still part of the imperial family. Then he smiled and said that it would be good if such a person would be her assistant. But if the girl made a single mistake, she would most likely be executed. After hearing such a thing, she only unhappily exhaled that she could not believe it and asked the commander to change his decision. But he calmly said that nothing can be changed, as the process has already started. But the excited protagonist only asked, since when such issues are solved so quickly. Then she noticed a huge rack of the best wines of their empire, and it was a dream wine that is made only in one region of the empire. And looking at it, Eloise immediately realized that it is quite strange that the commander, who always drank cheap alcohol, turned out to have a whole collection of such a rare wine. At that moment, the man, putting on his coat, was about to leave the office and wished Eloise good luck and advised her to continue working as hard as she did. But the next moment, the protagonist was literally inflamed because she remembered that this wine was from the region that belonged to Theodore's father. And it seems that many more people had heard about their commander's addiction to alcohol. So they decided to offer a bribe, which they would definitely accept. At this point, seeing the main character so angry, the excited liver de Lucy tried to run away and said that she had to leave urgently on business. But at that moment, she was stopped by the madly angry main character and wondered whether the girl found out about it all, and yet did not say anything. But she only excitedly began to say that she really knew nothing about anything. And now she also knew nothing. But Eloise de Blois was already unstoppable, and she, angrily shaking lover de Lucy, reported that such a thing was simply impossible, and they certainly knew everything, especially since the girl is said to know what color underwear Her Majesty the Empress is wearing today. But the madly excited Laver de Lucy said that this is just a silly exaggeration and she is not interested in other people's underwear. Then she shouted that perhaps she would only know about the underwear if it belonged to Mr. Morris. But at that moment, the young man who had entered so unexpectedly literally dropped all his documents. And then madly awkward Laver de Lucy inquired how long the young man had been here and began to justify herself and said that what he'd heard was just a misunderstanding. But the protagonist didn't seem to care at all. She approached her friend threateningly and asked if he had known about her new assistant all along. And livered to Lucy, who was standing behind her back, was trying to show the boy that he shouldn't have said anything about it. Then, picking up the papers which he had scattered, Morris said that last night they had suddenly received an official notice. It said it was an urgent matter of urgency. But the protagonist, looking at him unhappily, wondered if it was really true. And then, confirming his own words, Morris said that they wanted to postpone the matter until later in the day. But the notice had the emperor's seal on it. Upon hearing this, the madly shocked Eloise de Blois began to ponder since when did the imperial family interfere in the affairs of the knights? And she was sure that it was done intentionally and at a time when she was absent from the party. So I thought about the fact that the deputy commander's schedule was hard enough to get. And if someone could have access to her schedule and do it to satisfy his interest, it could only be one person. When the protagonist realized this, it seemed to her that she felt sick at the mere thought. Eventually, at that moment, Her Highness was approached by the butler and informed that a knight named Eloise de Blois had requested an audience with her. But she only calmly said that she had long been curious to know when the girl would arrive, and then asked to be let in. When the protagonist entered the hall, she bowed as she was supposed to and greeted the princess, and she, in turn, looked at her and asked if Eloise liked her gift. Then, trying to hide her displeasure, Eloise de Blois confirmed her guesses that it was this girl who was doing it. And as a future empress already at such a young age, the girl had a wide knowledge of military affairs, diplomacy, and politics. She was the daughter of the empire and kingdom of Lady Mary Josephine Clare, also known as the Princess Pepin, And then looking her over carefully, Mary inquired how Louise de Blois felt about her gift. And the protagonist was literally shaking with anger, asked what gift she meant. Although she understood perfectly well that the gift was her cousin, His Majesty the Emperor's negligent nephew. But at this moment, the princess, smiling, inquired what had happened to Louise de Blois, for she saw no satisfaction in her answer at all, though she confessed that it was all done in order to make Louise emotional. But after shining happily, she said that it was indeed a gift for her failed engagement, and looking at her satisfied face, the protagonist thought that it was as if the girl was just waiting for her to be washed, and she was madly angry at such a thing. At that moment, the princess looked at Louise carefully and congratulated her, because with the latest news, she should have already become a headline. Then she said that one of those headlines was "Evil Separator Destroys Centennial Union." The excited protagonist asked what that meant, but the princess calmly reported that the rumors had spread immediately after the party, then reported that the main character was accused of stealing Francois Joseph from Adelaide, or something like that. But madly angry Louise de Blois said that it even sounded funny, and such rumors really had no place. But seeing her anger, Maria calmly inquired, did she really think so? For that lady of the Grande family seemed a different person, and even the princess would never have thought that she could do such a terrible thing. And so now that the engagement of Louise de Blois had been ended in this way, the gossip mongers had a new cause. But at this moment, the insanely saddened Louise only wondered, why did Adelaide Grand do this to her? After all, they used to be madly friendly before. But at that moment, pulling her out of her musings, the princess turned to her and ordered the girl to raise her head and look at her. Whereupon she said that when her knight's honor was dishonored by such foolish things, she could not stand aside. Whereupon she said that in a way she was also madly angry, for Adelaide Grand had dared to dishonor her knight's virtues. After which she announced more cheerfully that it was for this reason that she had given her such a gift. But the discontented protagonist only inquired what Mr. Theodore Clermont had to do with her broken engagement. But the princess said with a laugh that Eloise seemed to be completely ignorant of such matters, and then added that she might not have known it, but that one scandal could be covered up by another. After which she explained that if the wild dove were under her control, the broken engagement would at once pass from the memory of the aristocrats. Then she said reflectively that she was madly sorry to realize that Theodore Clermont had been so easily disinherited, though he had only caused a stir, and then fled on the day of his knighting. But after the princess literally glowed and smiled, and said that according to her aunt now, that Theodore Clermont was back, her aunt would do her best to keep the boy here longer. And the princess thought about it, and decided that the most faithful person to whom she could entrust the care and control of Theodore Clermont could only be her sweet and faithful Louise de Blois. But the disgruntled protagonist reported that no one even doubted such a choice. And at that moment, Her Highness, wiping away her tears, informed that the girl had no idea how much her aunt had persuaded her, and as Louise de Blois should know, her princess had an insanely kind heart. Watching this from the sidelines, the protagonist wondered if this wasn't the first time Maria had tried to fool her with those tears. I wondered if she had decided to choose her to look after Theodore. But at that moment, my Highness smiled and said that it was so, and my aunt said that if it was Louise de Blois who would look after Theodore Clermont, she would agree to anything. Then, looking over the princess, the heroine thought that even if the imperial family seemed incredible on the outside, they needed someone to deal with such nuances. And she needed something grandiose, shocking to overshadow the scandal. So she realized that their interests coincided. But if she looked out for Theodore, she would die a lot faster. Then the girl bowed and said that, unfortunately, if it was Mr. Theodore Clermont, she could not agree. But the princess was only excitedly inquired whether she wanted to do her such a favor, but then calmly said that in fact it was not so simple and everything had already been decided. After which she realized that there was only one thing Louise liked best, so she moved closer and pressed against his palm and asked him how she felt about a 10% pay raise. In the end, when the protagonist came out of the imperial palace, she got excited and thought that as soon as she heard about the money, she couldn't refuse, and it was all because of her family's cursed debt. But then she thought that in any case, since this fact had already happened, she had to take advantage. Then she opened the door to her office and was greeted by Theodore Clermont. The heroine said from the doorway that they needed to have a serious talk, then calmly said that since the boy was now her assistant, in the future, if he disobeyed her orders, the punishment would be harsher than other knights. But the boy smiled and said that he realized and accepted such a condition, And looking at him with great surprise, Louise de Blois thought that during the training at the academy, this guy gave a more harsh and unpleasant impression. And it seems that the role of a messenger knight has changed him over the years. After that, the protagonist calmly went to her desk, but suddenly felt something approaching her with great speed. And thus she triggered the sixth sense, even before the guy had time to approach her. So the girl excitedly turned around and looked right at him, then excitedly wondered when this jerk had time to get closer. But he only calmly looked her over from top to bottom and asked what she was so very surprised about. He reached his hands into her hair, but Louise de Blois immediately said that he should have taken his hands off. But the man was not going to listen to her and said that Louise de Blois seemed to have forgotten that he was still her dog. So if the girl wanted to push him away like that, it would amuse him even more. But then Louise looked seriously at the insolent young man and said that he should have shut up, because it was she who had stopped him when he lost his temper during the knighting ceremony. And since she had decided to keep him at the princess's request, it must not happen again, and she would not let it happen. But at that moment, the young man looked at her gravely and asked if she was afraid of the wild dog too. The girl was madly surprised to hear this, because she was not afraid of the young man. So calmly looked at him and said that she really had no fear of him. After all, a knight has no fear. The only exception is the fear of his master. So she had no one to fear but her master, the princess, and she was sure that the young man was aware of it. But then he lowered his eyes sadly and said that in that case, Louise should have tightened his leash. And the protagonist looked at him and wondered what kind of leash he was talking about and what he was talking about. But instead of answering her question, Theodore Clermont took her hand and put it round his neck and informed her that from that moment on, in every situation, Louise de Blois could call him by his shortened name, and that would be the leash for the wild dog. Eventually, night fell, and the protagonist had a dream where she stood chained together with a screaming mob around her calling her a witch and a vicious traitor and ordering her to die as soon as possible. And then the knight approaching her announced that the girl would be executed for mass murder and treason. But in the next moment, the agitated protagonist woke up abruptly from her horrible dream and screamed, gasping with horror. But after calming down, she realized that it seems that she can't sleep anymore. And so she left her room. And when she went below, she found her nurse sitting by the stove, who was surprised at Louise's early rising. But she calmly said that she could not sleep well because of her nightmares. At that moment, the nanny smiled consolingly and thought that she ought to turn the subject to something else as soon as possible, so that the girl would not worry so much. So she said that Louise should sit down at the table while she made her breakfast. And the girl, agreeing, immediately reached for the newspaper. The first headline said that the wild dog was appointed Louise's assistant. And reading about it, the girl thought that, as the princess had said, her broken engagement had been forgotten. This was good, but after remembering the face of Theodore Clermont, who said that he was looking forward to working with them, and the girl did not understand why, despite the fact that she was only trying to solve one problem, she was so stressed. And suddenly she found that I did not want to go to work at all. At that moment, her nurse came up to her and, having put the food on the table, informed her that she would have roasted and baked bread for breakfast and offered her something to eat. But at that moment, Louise de Blois suddenly asked her nurse if she had ever dreamed of her own execution. But she only excitedly said that it was difficult for her to remember such a dream, because she never remembers her dreams. But then she said that she'd heard somewhere that if you dream about your own death, it brings good luck. But after consoling, the girl said that the dream was still a dream, so it was not worth giving it much importance. Thinking about her words, the protagonist stated that the reason she had been having nightmares lately was probably because she was too tired and stressed out. So she resolutely began to eat, realizing that in this way she could regain her strength. But the excited nurse, seeing Louise's appetite, she wondered if she was so hungry. The girl smiled and said that her meat roast was delicious. She was very embarrassed, though, because at that moment she probably looked like a hungry dog that had pounced on its prey. In the end, when the protagonist came to work, she was looked at by Maurice Dury, who said that Lisa was already 20 minutes late, and she only asked him what he meant by that, because she already knew she was late. Then she thought that it had been 2 days since Theodore Clermont had been appointed her assistant, and she was going mad because of it. She had her own office, but for some reason he wouldn't go in there, and Maurice, who was watching, was laughing and mocking Louise a little. And he said that he had no idea that their lovely Louise de Blois could be afraid of anything, and wondered how the girl could be afraid of her own assistant. But the protagonist, in all seriousness, said that she was really afraid of Mr. Theodore Clermont, so she proposed to exchange assistants. At this point, having slammed the book he was reading before, the guy immediately said that it was already insanely late and he should have left. After which the protagonist gave the book and said that it was a gift. The book was called Bad Dogs Never Happen, and then waved to the main character saying that nobody knows, and maybe one day such a book will be useful to her. And disgruntled L. Louis de Blois, just looking at the textbook, thought that apparently the guy insanely liked to mock her. But he, turning before finally leaving, informed that the girls should not forget that today there would be a special event for the Knights. And then L. Louis de Blois only thought that today would definitely go crazy, either because of Theodore Clermont or because of the other. The door was opened by Theodore Clermont, who looked at Eloise calmly, asked her why she had taken so long to come in, but she jumped up and said that the boy had scared her. But after the protagonist had looked at him earnestly, she asked him what reason Mr. Theodore Clermont had for calling her his mistress, after which she confessed that she had been trying to ask it for some time. But the guy only turned around and said that she addressed him incorrectly and made a mistake because earlier he had asked to call him by his shortened name. Then the protagonist made a concession and called him what he wished and asked why he called her that, but he calmly said that it was quite simple, because Mrs. L. Louise de Blois was his mistress. Then looking at him madly unhappy, the girl thought that apparently the guy was just trying to avoid answering. So she said that she could understand since they had gone to the military academy together. But she was concerned about the reason why the guy so suddenly began to call her mistress. But he calmly repeated that it was due to the fact that Mrs. L. Louise de Blois was his mistress, and then madly dissatisfied with such an answer, the protagonist asked why the aristocrats of the highest rank decided to become assistant deputy commander. But he smilingly said that it was all because of the mistress. Then the protagonist madly grudgingly told him to stop and told Mr. Theodore that she did not care what the young man really thought of her, but from now on he must call her Lady L. Louise de Blois. But he calmly informed her that he refused. At this point, the insane protagonist, who was literally ready to throw lightning at the young man, did not understand what was happening to her, and it seemed that she was about to definitely go crazy. At that moment, Theodore Clermont got up from his seat and came closer to say that in any case from today, he would work hard for the main character, because he was so excited that he hadn't slept all night. But the protagonist told Mr. Theodore Clermont to get away from her. But it seems that he was not even going to listen to her, and then the girl realized that as she expected, the guy was insanely dangerous and should be ready for something like this. So the next moment, with a slight movement, she pinned the guy on the table, and he only asked with a smile to the protagonist try to tame him. But she calmly explained that the guy himself understands everything perfectly well. After all, she heard that he does not show interest in what does not entertain him, and wondered was she really that interesting to him. But after getting excited, she wondered for what reason at this moment Theodore Clermont looked so relaxed and content. And apparently this jerk was really enjoying the process. But at that moment, Laver de Lucy burst into her office and announced that she was on her way to the main office. But afterwards, she wondered madly if she had come at the wrong time and had distracted them. And then the insanely frightened protagonist told the girl that she was right on time and tried to come up with an excuse. But at that moment, a man, picking up the cloak that lay on the table behind the protagonist as he came closer. The man reported that L. Louise de Blois was constantly snapping at him. After all, he only wanted to take the cloak from the mistress, and the latter, blushing madly with embarrassment, confessed that she had not even thought of something like that. At this point, the protagonist inquired Laver de Lucy, is she really going to the main office? Then she said that Mr. Theodore should have gone with the girl to see the documents she had given him, but he only asked excitedly whether it was necessary to do it now. But L. Louise de Blois said that it was a great opportunity for him to learn about the work of his older comrades from Laver de Lucy, and then thought that it was also a great chance to get rid of him. At this point, the guy accepted the document, said that if the mistress ordered him to do so, he complied with her request. Hearing this, Livered only wondered why the guy was called in this way, and the heroine reminded him not to call her in this way and to address her simply by her first name. Eventually, the insanely satisfied Theodore, approaching, stood opposite L. Louise and waited for something. And realizing his intention, the protagonist informed him that she was ordering him as his mistress, that he should learn all he could, and inquired whether he understood her orders, at which point Theodore Clermont, smiling madly smugly, announced that he had understood his mistress. At this moment, Laver de Lucy was watching the whole scene excitedly. So when they went outside, noticing this look, the man inquired, did she have something to say to him? But the girl calmly said that Theodore Clermont was indeed irresistible, and if he smiled as he had smiled at Eloise, he would win a great many girls. But the boy only grudgingly said that it was strange enough to hear such a thing from Liver de Lucy, for he was sure that the girl was much more interested in Mr. Morris. The nun only excitedly inquired how the man knew about it, and perhaps he could read minds, and she was madly fascinated by such a skill. But afterwards more calmly inquired for what reason the lad called Eloise de Blois his mistress, but he calmly informed her that it was rather difficult to explain, and perhaps there were several reasons for it. After which he smiled and informed that there could only be one mistress for him anyway. And on hearing of this, the madly excited and joyful Liver de Lucy said that she had the same, and to her only Morris could be a gentleman. So they were probably in a similar situation. Finally, after a little more walking, they found themselves near a big building, and then the girl said that they had arrived, and it was the main office building. Then she warned the guy that from now on he should be very attentive, because senior colleagues are very picky. In the end, the protagonist, madly dissatisfied, took the book that Morris gave her and realized that most likely has already finally lost her mind, because no matter what the guy did, he was still a human being. Walking helps to relieve stress, find a common language with other dogs, and is a natural necessity for both mental and physiological health. After reading about it, the girl thought that maybe it was really worth going for a walk, and maybe Theodore Clermont would behave better if he took a walk. After that, the protagonist leaned back in her chair and thought about the fact that because I was having nightmares, she hadn't been able to sleep well, and now she felt tired. But then she thought that Liver de Lucy and Theodore Clermont would need some time to negotiate with the aristocrats, so she could get some sleep. But at that moment, just as she relaxed into the room, the young men burst into the room, and the madly joyful girl reported that she felt a great sense of satisfaction, for she still could not believe that their older colleagues had agreed to everything so quickly, and it was all thanks to Mr. Theodore. But the boy only said that the girl was embellishing everything, for he had done nothing specific, and was only following Eloise's instructions. Then, calmly looking them over, the protagonist reported that they both did a good job and didn't understand what they were even talking about. But at that moment, the insanely happy Liver de Lucy said that as soon as they arrived at the main office, the picky colleagues froze with fear just from one look at Mr. Theodore Clermont. And so they at once quite agreed. Then, unfolding the layers behind, immediately went away and said that she should have bribed to Mr. Morris de Ree. Looking after her, the heroine thought that even if Liver de Lucy was constantly exhausted after another report in the main office, and she absolutely did not understand what this harmful aristocrat guy could do without showing his evil and crazy side. Afterwards, she thought that, as it turned out, the guy was useful after all, although she thought he was a complete idler. Then, looking around her office, thought that even her office, which had been cluttered with mountains of papers, was suddenly very clean, and in a way, and was even sorry for the young man. But at the moment, he smilingly adjusted the collar of his sweater, and then at the same moment the girl excitedly shifted her gaze from him and thought she wished madly that Theodore hadn't noticed she was looking at him. But when she turned her gaze back to him, she saw the guy smiling madly and excitedly. She didn't understand why he kept looking at her. She thought that she'd been too hard on him because the red marks on his neck were still visible, but she still didn't understand why he was staring at her so intently. Then she grabbed the water and thought that because of such excitement, even a simple sip of water was given with great difficulty. But she was still thirsty, and in the next moment, a few drops of water got past her mouth and flowed towards her chin. But when she looked at Theodore Clermont again, she was horrified to realize that apparently the guy had been watching her wipe the water off her face the whole time. So she grudgingly announced that that was enough work for today. But an agitated Theodore Clermont inquired why she said that, for he still had to look at the theft case she had assigned to him. But Eloise calmly said that this week she would let the boy get used to paperwork for the time being. Then she smiled and said that the reason was that Theodore Clermont was going to patrol the streets with her, and so she decided to take him out for a little walk. But eventually, when they were outside, you also wondered what a smile does going further down the street. Bring them to Favenue Street, she calmly agreed. When Theodore heard this, he marveled that Eloise de Blois was a good navigator, but she calmly explained that this neighborhood was under the command of the knights, and mostly wealthy people lived here, and the streets were quiet. But it was still impossible to be vigilant because even here there were crimes. Then calmly informed him that from now on Theodore Clermont would be out patrolling the streets more often, and unless it was a special occasion, it would be the two of them. Then coming closer to her and smiling, Theodore Clermont inquired, is it really going to be just the two of them? And an excited Louise de Blois informed her that he was indeed right, after which she awkwardly admitted that the fellow was too close to her. Eventually he moved on, and Theodore, smiling happily, went forward, and looking around him, the protagonist thought that he seemed to be in a good mood, and perhaps the dog book was really more useful than she had thought. But after the main character excitedly grabbed her sword, because she sensed someone's presence and was ready to attack. Then in the darkness, she saw an insanely sinister pair of bright red eyes that were leisurely approaching her. But in the end, it turned out to be a kitten. And then the girl looked at it carefully, madly surprised, and said that she had been mistaken. And Theodore calmly said that the kitten was insanely cute. But in the end, it turned out that the situation was completely different, and they had no idea that at the same time, in the same place, someone was desperately trying to hide from them. In the end, looking at Theodore, Clermont Louise de Blois said that she thought she was beginning to lose her grip. But the boy calmly reported that it was all to do with the fact that the neighborhood was quiet. But she said they actually had a thief who'd been bugging them. And this thief's name is Marshmallow. He was famous for robbing aristocratic houses in the area, but they never managed to track him down. That's why the knights gave him that name. Then Theodore Clermont wondered if they called him Marshmallow. Then they were talking about the god of the west winds. The girl, confirming his guesses, said that the thief received this nickname for his ability to move like the wind. She said that she had realized from the beginning that the case would not be easy. But as she had expected, they had not even managed to find any trace of him. But then Theodore Clermont asked if the girl wanted to walk around a little more. But she calmly said that it was not necessary, and they could finish their patrol. Then she said that their working day would soon be over. But at that moment, Theodore Clermont, who was madly distressed at this, said that he was anxious to walk a little longer with her. And Eloise, looking at him, thought that the boy was really acting like a dog. But the girl only smiled and said that they had already gone around the streets twice and wondered if Theodore Clermont was not tired, and asked that for the next patrol he should memorize everything they saw here. But suddenly the thief crashed into the girl with great speed, and then the last thing she heard was the heart-rending scream of Theodore Clermont. In the end, because of so strong a blow, the protagonist did not fall, but twisted her ankle badly, and then Liv on Theodore Clermont asked that he look at and give her first aid, but she calmly reported that everything was fine. Then she said that the bag was heavy, and there was probably something valuable in it, but worried, Theodore, looking back, said that the first thing to do was to take the lady to the doctor. She reported that the fellow really ought not to have bothered to broadcast, but when she saw the doubt on the young man's face, she shouted to Theodore Clermont that it was an order and he was to go and catch the rascal. Then the agitated Theodore grudgingly clenched his fists and immediately ran without disobeying the heroine's order. After tearing after the thief, he wondered that this thief couldn't have escaped that far. And in the end, it turned out to be so, and after a couple of streets and turns, he caught up with the thief and was about to strike him. But at the last moment, he managed to dodge and ran away. And then, insanely displeased at this thief's behavior, the young man inquired if he really expected him to concede him this victory, after which he reached in with a few leaps and, throwing him off the house, angrily looked at him and asked him how he dared to touch his mistress, and skidding sword to strike. At the last second, he asked that Theodore Clermont spare him, but he wasn't even going to do that, and only stopped when the protagonist approached him. And then she reported that that was enough, and she could not believe that Theodore Clermont had figured out these streets so easily, and he was learning fast enough. At the lad only excitedly. Looking her over, he inquired how she felt and how her leg was. But the heroine reported that she was perfectly fine now. At that moment, Maurice de Ré appeared from behind her and said that the pledge initiation party was a special event not to be missed. And then Eloise de Blois said that it had just happened. And then a frantic Theodore Clermont wondered if the guy had lured them to the bar on purpose. And Eloise pretended to twist her ankle. But at that moment, the girl looked at him calmly and told him that she was terribly sorry that they had to deceive Theodore. But they had all been through it at least once, so she asked him not to be upset. And then, recalling the past, Maurice said that if you think back, in his initiation, Eloise de Blois had just beaten the thief to the point of unconsciousness before he could even bring her to the bar. But at that point, the disgruntled protagonist reported that it had been an insanely long time ago. She then, extending her hand to the young man, admitted that now that they had come this far, she could no longer ignore him, and informed Mr. Theo that he was now officially in the ranks of the knights. after which she said that she had hoped madly for their cooperation. And Theodore smiled and thanked her for being on time, because he had almost done the irreparable. A flustered Morris seemed completely unaware of what they were talking about, and Louise de Blois, on her way to the bar, suggested they go in at last. But at the last moment, the protagonist turned to the guy who played the thief and praised him and said that he really did a great job. After all, he had a realistic game. But he literally shook his head in terror and realized that it was not a game at all, because Theodore really tried to kill him. And this man was insanely frightening. At this moment, as soon as they stepped inside, it was Livard who greeted them excitedly and stated that the main characters of the whole event had finally arrived, and she thought they would die before they waited for them. She then asked the others how it had gone, and Maurice de Ré smiled and said that it had been a 100% success and Theodore Clermont had done a great job. Then the protagonist calmly looked around and Livard asked where the commander was now, for she had not seen him in this hall. And the girl calmly reported that the man had gone to help with the case, and explained that the jeweler had repaired Her Majesty the Princess's broken obese, and the man was very worried that the marshmallow might be after the jewelry. So he asked the commander to help. After all, even among the nobles, there were quite a few thieves now too. At that moment, the white-haired young man interrupted them and said that this marshmallow thief was a problem, even though he was a thief. However, by stealing other people's things, the marshmallow was giving those things to poor children, and yet that didn't make his actions legal. But then Morris, smiling, asked if they were not here to celebrate, but to talk about their work once more. And then the heroine said that first they should all sit down in their seats, and told Theodore Clermont to sit down. And then looking at his new colleague, the guy smilingly asked if he could take the seat, and he seemed to be scared out of his wits by the company. Eventually, everyone was waiting for the celebration to begin, and then Morris, thinking to Eloise, asked if she could take a word on behalf of the command before starting their party as deputy commander. Then the girl who had risen from her seat announced that, as all knights know, they were here today to welcome Mr. Theodore Clermont as the newest member of their team. Then she said excitedly that she hoped that from today and from this initiation ceremony, all the knights would get to know Theodore better. And then she mentally added that the boy was the son of an earl and also a member of the imperial family, so they all had to be nice to him. But afterwards, raising her mug more calmly, she said that they should drink to Mr. Theodore, who had officially joined the knights. After which everyone happily began to drink and congratulate the young man, but he did not take his attentive gaze off the protagonist for a second. But at that moment, the protagonist noticed that there was now a rather strange atmosphere on the nights that didn't compare to any of their other usual get-togethers, and everything seemed rather too quiet for a night's party. After which she carefully examined Theodore Clermont in front of her and realized that he was of imperial blood, an earl's son, and the protagonist of unpleasant rumors. So such a thing was unsurprising. But at that moment came up the excited Livard de Lucy, who, looking around at everyone around her, inquired why they were all so quiet. And looking at this, Louise de Blois reflected that, unfortunately, not everyone was as sociable as this girl. But at this moment, Livard de Lucy turned to Theodore Clermont and thanked him for bailing her out. And then the knight, maddened by her words, inquired what it meant. And the girl calmly explained that she had a report to make to the main office. But Louise de Blois had sent Mr. Theodore Clermont with her. And then the excited knights inquired, did the two of them go to meet those impudent men? Listening to their conversation, the girl wondered if she shouldn't worry since Livard de Lucy was back, and now she should have left. But at that moment, her departure did not go unnoticed from the young man that, looking her over carefully, inquired where she was going to go, mistress. And immediately after her dreams, his words were noticed by absolutely all the knights, who were looking excitedly, not understanding where she was going. Whereupon all excitedly wondered to someone Theodore had just addressed as mistress. But afterwards, they immediately realized that he must have been calling the deputy commander so. And at that moment, without any embarrassment, Theodore again asked the mistress where she was going to go. And then all the knights realized that Theodore Clermont was indeed calling Louise de Blois mistress. And she was madly embarrassed to realize that she should have warned the guy not to call her like that in front of the other knights. And that's when she realized what this could lead to. And in the end, the insanely excited knights turned to her and asked if the protagonist hadn't noticed them, because they were new and they didn't even think she was like that. But she just excitedly said that they had completely misunderstood everything. But at this moment, Livard de Lucy joined in the conversation and said that perhaps Theodore Clermont's treatment of her was a kind of game, for she had already witnessed an interesting scene in her office. And thinking about it, the soldiers said that they were insanely offended that the deputy commander had behaved in a peculiar way with the young man. At this moment, one of the knights asked why then the representative of the imperial family was calling the deputy commander Madam. And Eloise excitedly didn't understand how to explain such a thing to them. But at that moment, Theodore stood up for her and said that he had called Louise de Blois, that because he owed her a debt. And she looked at him anxiously, not understanding why he had suddenly decided to answer. For up to this time, he had avoided answering her questions of this kind. And then the excited knights were madly surprised that even the highest aristocracy could be in debt and asked the deputy commander what Theodore owed her. But she only awkwardly informed that if they were so curious, it would be worth asking the young man. Then they were going to ask him, but looking at his calm expression, they thought that it was a bit impolite to ask him directly. And the protagonist, looking at them, realized that when it comes time to talk directly to Theodore Clermont, there are very few Desirees. But after turning around, I realized that I had to leave anyway. But at that moment, Laver de Lucy suggested that they should have fun and play a game of truth, and then told them that the main culprit of this celebration was Theodore. And to get to know him better, each of them had to ask him a question. And Theodore will drink a glass of her special cocktail as punishment for not answering a question. Then she started rummaging through her bag and said that anyway, she had brought a secret ingredient to improve her drink. And looking at it excitedly, Louise de Blois wondered if it was what she thought it was. And then the girl pulled out a crazy expensive wine. And when asked by Louise where the girl got it from, she awkwardly admitted that there were too many in the commander's office. So she stole one bottle for them. And then all the knights awkwardly conceived that it was not at all surprising that Laver de Lucy, the only, had failed the exam every year. But then one of the knights informed that drunk people were always different. And if they really wanted to bond over a shared drinking session, then the game really, this is the best option. After which looked excitedly at the protagonist, waiting for her decision. And the latter looked seriously at Theodore, asked if he agreed with Laver de Lucy, and if he wanted to participate in it. After which thought about the fact that Theodore Clermont would still say that he definitely did not like such ideas. But to her great surprise, he decisively and with a smile said that he really did not mind. And looking at him, the girl thought that the guy was really naive because he did not realize what awaited him. And one of the knights asked the protagonist if she was sure when she agreed to it, because they say that Laver de Lucy's special cocktail could render a bear unconscious with a single glass. But she calmly reported that Theodore Clermont was as much a man as they were. It's just that the royal family doesn't know how to have as much fun with alcohol as they do. So nothing would happen from one glass. Then she looked at her knights and said that she couldn't spoil the atmosphere so easily, and thought that she shouldn't worry about the questions either, since the knights can't talk to Theodore directly, and certainly can't ask personal questions. At this moment, Laver de Lucy smilingly announced that she wished to ask the first question, and inquired of Theodore whether he liked Louise de Blois. And the girl at that moment, as she drank her beer, immediately spat it back out. At this moment, seeing such a picture, Theodore Clermont reacted quickly and handed her his handkerchief to stand out and smiled affectionately at her. She awkwardly accepted his handkerchief and embarrassedly did not understand why the young man behaved like that. As a result, everyone around them admired the atmosphere that reigned around them and wondered if there were any relations between them. The guy was already ready to answer the question, and then the protagonist told Theodore Clermont not to answer and just drank. And the excited knights reported that they were insanely interested and asked Theodore Clermont to continue. But this moment, he, smiling and shining with his scarlet eyes, informed that no matter how many times he was asked, he would always answer one thing, and he was going to say that he really loved Eloisa. But at this moment, she shouted excitedly and told Theodore that it was an order, and he was not to answer, but to be drunk. And then took his glass. Theodore Clermont informed with a smile that he really could not disobey, for she was his mistress, and therefore he deserved to be punished. Afterwards, smilingly informed the protagonist that she really knew how to spoil him. At that moment, watching him, Lovard said excitedly that it was really a great pity. She thought they were in for something interesting, and she was sure that what he was going to say started with the letter L. And at that moment, the protagonist looked at Laver de Lucy with displeasure, thinking that she was going to kill her. But at that moment, she was approached by Theodore Clermont, who embarrassedly confessed that this cocktail was actually very tasty. And then Lucy asked him did he really like it, because it was her special cocktail, a real masterpiece, the recipe of which was passed down from generation to generation. But afterwards, the protagonist turned to him and inquired how quickly the young man was getting drunk, but immediately noticed that his eyes had become glassy and he had a strange look. But then the young man calmly said that he didn't know because he had never counted how much he drank. And at that moment, Eloise de Blois wondered if this young man was royalty, and they have alcohol running through their veins instead of blood. So she was worried for nothing. But at this point, Theodore Clermont continued and said that he didn't remember because he always got drunk to the point of losing his pulse. Hearing this, Eloise de Blois was really shocked and didn't know how to react to it, and wondered whether to call the guy an ambulance already. But at that moment, pouring another glass of Laver de Lucy, said that they had already finished tasting and asked who wants to ask the following questions. And the knights looking at the new glass wondered how normal it would be to treat royalty in such a way. And the protagonist, remembering the captain's warning that if something happens to Theodore Clermont, she will be taken away from life, immediately thought that if this continues, she and all the other knights will be in huge trouble. But at that moment, without waiting for the next person who wanted to ask, Laver de Lucy, holding out her glass to Theodore, said that since no one wanted to ask him, she would ask him herself. At that moment, the girl took the glass from Laver de Lucy and said that from now on, she would be Theodore's Dark Knight, and she thought that for the sake of Theodore's safety, she would drink for him. The girl was standing on the balcony trying to catch her breath. Morris was beside her, wondering if she was all right, but she calmly informed him that she wasn't okay at all. After all, the guy ever drank the cocktail that Laver de Lucy makes. He knew exactly how she felt. But at that moment, the girl asked Morris de Ré whether even if he had said nothing, they would still have made up their minds. But he calmly informed her that it would probably be so, because as soon as Eloise de Blois grabbed her glass, everyone started asking her strange questions, like how long have they known each other, what Theodore Clermont liked about Eloise, whereupon Morris awkwardly apologized for his subordinate Laver de Lucy and said that he had scolded her for it, but now it was pointless. On the main character only calmly reported that he should have forgotten about it, because, in truth, if not Laver de Lucy, Theodore Clermont would not have been able to fit into their company, and today, thanks to alcoholism, they all became closer. But afterwards, she gave the young man's shoulder a firm squeeze and told him that they would all meet at the training arena tomorrow and bond even more. And the boy immediately realized what she was getting at, and then informed her that she remembered perfectly what role the guy had played in it all, and how many questions he would ask her would be his punishment for failing to take responsibility and allowing others to lure him into such games. Then informed that moreover the guy couldn't handle his own subordinate, and so she had chosen a special punishment for him. But afterwards they both noticed that it was insanely quiet around. So, bursting into the room, she found the knights insanely drunk, and Laver de Lucy happily pouring her special cocktail for everyone. And then the girl, looking excitedly at Theodore's body, asked what had happened here. And the excited knights tried to explain that they were definitely trying to stop Laver de Lucy. But the protagonist only shouted unhappily and wondered why, if they knew the guy had such a low tolerance for alcohol, they were getting him drunk. After which she immediately shouted Morris, who already realized what was waiting for him. So awkwardly asked how many laps the girl would make them run tomorrow, but she only called them retarded morons. At this time, in the imperial palace, in the office of the princess, entered the maid who said that it was time for her to go to bed, but she calmly said that she was not tired yet. But at this moment, the maid said that the princess was the future of this country, and she had to go to bed early to grow big. She did heed the advice and rose from her seat, but at that moment she stopped. And when the maid inquired did anything happen, she looked up at the sky with a smile and thought of something, after which she confessed that everything was all right. And she herself reflected that surely Eloise de Blois was now having fun with Theodore Clermont. But at the same time, the girl was carrying the guy and resented how heavy he was. She was already having a hard time because the guy was heavy, and the fact that he was tall added to the problem. Some of them said that they could not just touch a royal person, while others were afraid that they might be executed for such insolence. So they said that in the end, they could only hope for Eloise's help. But in the end, Morris offered to help her, and they started to take him away together. The protagonist only awkwardly remarked that she had no idea that the guy would be so heavy, after which she reflected that she also seemed to be drunk. But she noticed that Morris was laughing and wondered what that had to do with it. And the man only embarrassedly reported that he could never think of carrying a wild dog home. Then confessed that he had previously thought that Theodore would never return to the capital, and perhaps he could not have imagined that he could become so close to this young man. But eventually, after a couple minutes, they got the guy into the carriage. And Louise said she hadn't expected this either. But now the princess and empress had asked her to take custody of Theodore. And looking at him, the girl thought that now she had no other choice but to try not to disappoint anyone. Then she awkwardly said that they would end up paying dearly for Theodore being in such a bad state, and maybe she could already say goodbye to the princess and empress. But the agitated young man asked her to calm down and informed her that if the girl was so anxious about it, she could personally take Theodore home after returning, because the princess is close to her family. So it would be good if she herself went and explained everything. Heard about it, the excited protagonist noticed that the guy was absolutely right, and so said that in that case they could go together with Maurice Doré. But he immediately came up and opened the door of her carriage and told her that the girl should have been as careful as possible and wished her good luck. And she only thought unhappily that Maurice had behaved so disgustingly, and so began to rise unhappily into the carriage. But at the last moment, a young man addressed her and informed her that the girl should not forget that the lives of their knights, who had drunk Theodore Clermont to such a state, were now in her hands. And the heroine only looked at him gravely and said that Maurice knew her well, so he needn't worry, and she would take care of everything. Finally glancing excitedly around the departing carriage with the girl and the pulse-drunk fellow royalty, Maurice reflected that now it was time for him to get busy putting things in order. But when he came back, he was excitedly approached by a knight who asked him for help. And when she looked at this picture, she saw that all the knights around were incredibly drunk and seemed to be about to die. Then he sadly noticed that Livard was once again able to get all the knights drunk, as she had been every time. So he approached her and told her that it was getting late and it was time for them to go home. And she only looked at him, excitedly asked when he had time to come, then immediately went over to him and hugged him. And the madly embarrassed young man only asked how much she had drunk. But the next moment, absolutely unexpectedly, the girl grabbed him by his uniform and grudgingly asked how Maurice could do to her in such a way. Because of him, she wasted such a life. And the guy, only in shock, did not understand how much the girl drank since so behaves. But at that moment, she let go of him and exhaustedly sat down in her seat, sadly informing the guy that she liked him insanely much, and she could never leave that jerk. Then she laid her head on his arm and closed her eyes and began to drift off to sleep. And the last thing she said was that even though Maurice was a fool, she would forgive him. And the young man that watched all this with a smile thought that the girl drank too much, but this time he was ready to forgive her. At this time, the protagonist, who was riding in the carriage, was looking out of the window at the scenery flying by and thinking of the fact that they would soon arrive at the estate. But after looking over the young man to see that he was lying covered opposite her, she wondered if Theodore slept comfortably enough in so cramped a carriage. After which again her thoughts drifted towards Francois, and she restlessly pondered the fact that the guy had never acted like that. After which she remembered how this insanely smiling and kind guy had said nice words to the protagonist. And then Louise confessed that although she pretended that everything was all right, she didn't really believe the truth yet. And she couldn't believe that he'd been able to tell her so easily that he didn't love her anymore. But afterwards, she thought sadly that in the end, she had just spent a few years of her life in vain and had loved Francois without any reciprocity. And perhaps it was natural that they eventually broke up. But she sadly confessed that to her great regret, she had not yet lost her feelings for the young man, and she still loved him. But at that moment, there was a voice of a guy who got up from his seat and said that he was insanely hot. And then with a smile looking at him, Louise admitted that thanks to this guy, she had almost no time to be sad. But then she looked at him in shock and didn't understand what he was doing. And he started taking off his sweatshirt, drunk, and kept saying he was insanely hot. And then the flustered protagonist got up from her seat and yelled that he shouldn't have done it and called him crazy and ordered him to keep his stuff on. But the next moment, the carriage jumped up on a rock, and the protagonist flew swiftly towards the young man. But he, even in spite of his condition, still picked her up. And then she became madly excited and thought that something terrible had almost happened, and told the boy that she was madly sorry and that she would return to her seat so that he could ride more comfortably. But in the next moment, he reacted quickly and flipped her over and put her back in the seat, and then gently touched her face. And the protagonist was agitated and didn't understand what this guy was doing. And maybe it was the alcohol talking in him now. And if that was the case, it was very bad. So she excitedly informed the gentleman that he should have stopped, but only with a sort of sadness, looking back at her, asked that she let him do it just once.